working your body harder, wearing it out faster, being at higher risk of injury because you're working with machines that set an unrealistic pace is not the cyborg future we're hoping for. Just to be very clear.
All right. I'm here today with Professor Danya Glabau and Professor Laura Forlano. Danya, Laura, thank you for being on Urgent Futures.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I think it's important in talking about the cyborg to first begin with an introduction to who you are and what led you to this particular topic. Danya, you're the screen to my immediate right, so I'll start with you.
Great. So I'm a professor here at NYU Tandon School of Engineering. I'm the social scientist in the engineering school, teach students ethics and research and writing. But how did I get to the cyborg? I was actually hooked on it in graduate school. I came to graduate school with some questions about how people understand and integrate technologies, especially medical technologies, into their everyday lives. And the first time I read Donna Haraway's essay, The Cyborg Manifesto, it really grabbed me in the ways that it kind of talked about being kind of cautious about technology, pushing technology, the technology industry, technologists to do better in terms of inclusivity and imagination about the future, but also really embraced it. And so that kind of echoed where I was coming from and what I was interested in. And I just got hooked. I got hooked on the essay. I got hooked on the topic of cyborgs. Also tapped into a lifelong love of science fiction and fantasy. And it's just developed over the years in my teaching and in my writing in particular. So now I teach classes on cyborgs, I teach classes on ethics and technology, and I incorporate some of the things that we'll talk about today about the figure of the cyborg, the relationship between science, technology, and bodies, all of that really central to my research today as well.
So in my case, I first read the Cyborg Manifesto around 2010. So it was after I got out of grad school. So again, I'm a professor of design at Northeastern University in Boston in the art and design and comm studies departments. And I was at a conference in 2010, and that's around that time I had recently just read Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto. And then I also was diagnosed as type 1 diabetic around 2011 and started using medical technology. And so the concept of the cyborg just made a lot of sense to me, thinking about how to write about that topic and how to write about living with machines in your body, such as an insulin pump and sensor system. And then, interestingly enough, I actually took Danya's Haraway course at the Brooklyn Institute around 2016. Mm-hmm. And that was when I was able to get a little bit more deep into other readings also around feminist science and technology studies. And then we started talking around 2018, to work together on this book. So we have a really great kind of cyborg origin story for the book as well.
I love that. I want to begin kind of with the beginning, but in the way that you begin this book, which is to say, there's a way we could start where we say, what's a cyborg? And what do people get wrong about cyborgs? What are the misconceptions? You very deftly enter into that conversation by referencing Sophia the robot. So I wanted to see if we could get into that sort of establishing work by looking at that example that you bring up.
Yeah, sure. So, we wanted to start with a figure of the cyborg, in this case, a robot or an android, more specifically a humanoid robot that was maybe familiar to people, that was at the time that we were starting our project still quite new and exciting, but that we saw some things to be cautious about. So for those who aren't familiar, Sophia is a kind of a prototype android made by the company Hanson Robotics that is kind of sort of constructed and decorated as a kind of normatively pretty young white woman. And in Sophia's appearances in the media after her release at South by Southwest, she is very polite. She waits her turn to speak. She laughs at the bad jokes of the male hosts of late night TV shows. All of these things that in society are often kind of correlated with proper femininity, waiting your turn, being polite, laughing at the men's bad jokes. And so, it's this kind of complicated thing where on the one hand, I too am very excited when I see new technologies, new digital technologies, new robotic technologies, but I'm also quite concerned when I see those kind of social stereotypes built into them. In this case, seemingly really core to Sophia's being as a android person, as a robotic person, right? All of her mannerisms are kind of built around this idea of femininity, right? You couldn't imagine the same robot with a more masculine looking face interacting in the same way. It would be weird, right? So, that kind of begs the question, well, why are we building these social stereotypes like gender stereotypes, gender norms into a technology that doesn't really need them? Right, at its core. So this is kind of one starting point for us for thinking about the cyborgs, and especially thinking about the cyborg from a feminist perspective. What social values, social categories are we building into new technologies? Do they really need to be there? Or could new forms of technology be a kind of testing ground for thinking about new ways, better ways maybe, to be human and to interact not only with those technologies, but with other humans around them?
Yeah, and I would maybe extend that also saying that there are kind of two parts to Haraway's version of a cyborg, and we pick up on both. And one of them is really the critique that you often hear in the social sciences among sociology and anthropology and science and technology studies, critiques about the harms of new AI systems, critiques about, the ways in which robots are designed. And then the other is really possibility. It's about creativity, it's about possibility, futures, right? And so we wanted to definitely extend both of those parts of the argument. And then thinking about specifically the chapter on art and design, showing examples from artists who have engaged with the cyborg in many different ways over the last several decades, and try to use those examples as well as electronic music and other creative practices to show why the term is resonant and what it means to such a wide variety of practices.
Okay, before we get to those, I want to hit the rewind button. And could you walk us through the phases of the cyborg, beginning with its history in cybernetics? We can touch on Cyborg Manifesto. I want to come to that a little bit later in the conversation. But yeah, I want to open up to that origin story.
Yeah, I can jump in again. The cyborg is short for cybernetic organism. It's a coinage from 1960 by Nathan S. Klein and Manfred Kleins, a physiologist and a psychiatrist. And it was kind of proposed in the context of the Cold War and the space race as one model, or one figure is a word that we often use now, for thinking about how to best prepare humankind, or man in their words, for space travel. Right? So it was a way to get away from building large structures, large spaceships, big bulky spacesuits, and to think about, well, how can we change the human body? How can we change man's body to adapt to space instead of building all these structures and environments? And so they thought of it as a way not only to solve this engineering problem of how can we most efficiently get humans into space, but they also even kind of thought of it as, well, maybe this is a way that technology could even advance human evolution, right? And so I think you see kind of both sides of the cyborg now when we think about health technologies, body technologies, but especially in conversations about space travel still, right? There are conversations not only about the technical obstacles, how do we technically or economically or politically get into space, but also, what do these changes that it would take for us to get to the moon or to get to Mars in a long-term basis, how would those maybe change humanity for the long term as well, right? Change our trajectory as a culture, a civilization, or a species. And so I think it's kind of interesting. Not only is a cyborg, this figure that solves a problem, but it's also a figure to which we can attach a lot of different ways to imagine very distant futures as well. And I think it kind of preserves that spirit today. The cyborg, in the sense of this original proposal to modify the human body, add new hormone systems, or maybe low temperature durability features, or, there's a long discussion in the original article about how do you prepare people emotionally and psychiatrically to withstand the loneliness of space travel as well, right? The amount of time that it takes to get to somewhere like the moon or to Mars. We never fix those as engineering problems. We're still humans, mostly living here on Earth. But the cyborg very quickly gets taken up, of course, in science fiction. There are already all kinds of robots and androids and other figures in science fiction. The cyborg becomes another way to talk about augmented humans. Again, whether it's physically augmented or mentally augmented or potentially both. And it's in the 1980s where the cyborg becomes an interest and a concern in philosophy, feminist theory, and later other branches of the humanities like literature, history, anthropology, and even art criticism. And so this is really inaugurated through Donna Haraway's essay, A Manifesto for Cyborgs, and where she kind of takes this figure and uses it as a way to theorize the kind of real world interactions that she observes in the 1980s between humans and machines. And she's especially interested in how technologies are further reifying, further cementing, and extending some of the social inequalities, especially around race, class, gender, and colonialism. And so from there, again, it's been taken up into all of these humanities fields, taken up into art criticism, into pop culture. Even technologists that I've worked with are familiar with the more kind of philosophical idea. And again, it indexes this kind of tension between hope and fear of how technologies might affect humanity or even the planet, tensions between imagination and reality. Are we talking about real technologies or real people who are already deeply intertwined with technologies, or are we talking about imaginations for the future? And so it's a figure that lets us kind of think across these dichotomies, or think about two sorts of problems at the same time, to figure out, how technology can ultimately, serve the best interests of humanity, the best interests of our planet. So that's a really big picture trajectory there. Laura, if you want to fill in any of that,
I'll
maybe you
just
can
add
speak
a
to take up in art a
small,
little bit.
I'll just add a small footnote, which is that the other site, aside from space travel, one of the other sites in the kind of origin story of the term cybernetics was in psychiatric institutions, and specifically delivering drugs, intravenously to mental patients, and sort of the kinds of devices that are used that, today, if you have cancer and need a treatment, that there are small, essentially small tubes that can go under the skin. With diabetes, there's also, an insulin pump and sensor system, which also goes under the skin. And a lot of these were pioneered in those sites as well, as part of the same project. Yes.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of those projects come out of what was called bionics in the 1960s. My mentor, Ronald Klein, writes about how this is basically the only part of cybernetics that becomes an actual physical science, right? All of the others stay imaginary, right? You have sort of cybernetic theory that goes into management theory as well. But in terms of actual engineering problems solved through cybernetics, or with this metaphor of the cyborg, it's really these medical problems, these medical techniques that are developed as part of bionics that last with us.
One thing I really experienced reading your book, which is just so excellent, and I can't recommend it enough, is the paradoxes and tensions that the word itself, cyborg, holds. And Danya, to your last point, there's the through line even to now where people are going to come to the conversation of the cyborg with Sophia the Robot in mind, or Seven of Nine, or some of these other cyborg sort of sci-fi examples that you reference. And then, of course, also one of the later considerations and critiques of the manifesto is thinking around disability studies, cryptborgs, triborgs, that tension. I guess the way I want to get into that conversation is, why do you think the term or set of ideas is somehow capacious enough to hold these juxtapositions and therefore persist as a field of study or an area of interest, where, as you pointed out, so many other domains of cybernetics dash something else kind of fell off to the side?
Yeah. I mean, I think, I've done a lot of this thinking alongside, in conversation with or through the writing of my former mentor, Ronald Klein, and kind of the blessing and the curse of cybernetics. It's, kind of this kind of scientific paradigm that gives birth to the figure of the cyborg, the proposal in this paper. The kind of blessing and the curse of cybernetics is that it's very capacious, right? It is large enough to, by the mid 1960s, include bionics, include certain problems being solved in mechanical engineering, management theory, but also philosophy, also anthropology, also sociology, right? And so it's very capacious. It's a paradigm for thinking about how complex systems work that can be applied in many, many fields, but that's also why it kind of dissolves as its own field, right? And so I think the cyborg is maybe symptomatic of the fate of that scientific field as well, right? Kind of instantly becomes a pop culture figure, instantly becomes quite popular, but doesn't fully deliver on the scientific side. I think there's also a really interesting thing going on here, and I'd love to hear if you have kind of seen examples of this in your interviews, Jesse. But there's this other dimension where now you sometimes see technologists pointing towards science fiction, towards cyborgs as inspiration for the types of things I want to build in the real world, right? Or digital technologies, right? The kind of ideal for a future smartphone is always like the Star Trek tricorder, right? Which is kind of a messaging device and also like a magical like health healing device, right? Depending on which version of Star Trek you're watching. So I think there's such an interesting interplay here, and while that's sort of culturally interesting, I think often scientists and engineers also are cautious about engaging with ideas once they get to that level of popularity, because again, they could mean a lot of things, and engineers want that precision. So those are some of my kind of pet theories there. But again, I'd be very curious to hear if you have observed anything in your travels and interviews that might speak to this.
Well, what's immediately coming to mind is the torment nexus tweet,
Mm-hmm.
where it's basically like, sci-fi author, we've developed the torment nexus, and it's this cautionary tale on why you shouldn't do X, Y, Z. I'm butchering the tweet, and then it's
Right.
like, technologist, we have made the torment nexus.
Right. That's right.
And I think there's a little bit of that I see play out. And you reference in the book Neuralink and Meta's particular take on the metaverse, which I think are two very salient examples. I also think there's this aspect of drift where, like, because we live in this hyper mediated context that people are inclined to just sort of piecemeal pull out the pieces they like, it's not so much just techno-utopianism versus critique. It's this sort of collage of people who are sensitive, like just spoke with Professor Lisa Masseri and talking about the ways that the VR industry situated in Los Angeles was home to sort of these paradoxes of, like, people who wanted to use the technology for good, but yet were also in many ways perpetuating many of the inherent harms of those technologies. So I see it more like that. It's less like a particular example that I would like point to, and more that I feel like the individual points will be atomized, where you'll have somebody whose work is ultimately like working at a startup, under the conditions of late capitalism to try to like carry out some transhumanist or techno-optimist end, but who will reference Donna Haraway as like a major influence.
Right.
Um, I
Or
also
Pope referencing Donna Haraway in the recent encyclical, right?
totally.
Yeah,
Totally.
sure.
Right. And I think that in the book, we argue that the kind of transhumanist version of technologies that are really extending life is one that we disagree with. And we think that it's a misunderstanding of Haraway's Cyborg to go too far in that direction. So there's a version of kind of post-human and transhuman that we very much disagree with. But then there's also a version that's talked about now in academia often as post-human or more than human, which is really about, can be about thinking more about relational ways of living. It can be about thinking about the natural environment and sustainability. It can be about thinking about technology, but in a very different way than the post-human and transhuman version.
Mm, mm. Well, yeah, Laura, I wanted to open to you, kind of going back to an earlier question, or sort of you sort of brought it up, and I want to kind of go back to it around artists and designers who are picking up this concept, and in many cases picked it up not even citing the cyborg as the their end, but rather it just embodies aspects of cyborg theory. So could you share a few of the examples you reference in the book to kind of give us the landscape of, or not the landscape, but give us some examples of what artists, designers, cultural producers have been doing as it relates to the cyborg?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting chapter to work on because it did, really involve some research to kind of piece together these different kinds of arts practices, different kinds of materials. The first artist that we talk about in the book is Namjoon Paik, who's a Korean artist that was working in the 60s and has these pretty well-known sculptures made of cathode ray TVs, and the version of the cyborg that kind of makes sense in that work. I mean, clearly those sculptures, some of them are shaped as bodies but made of kind of TVs, so they really do look like robots in many ways. And that version was really the version of the kind of information superhighway, kind of the early inspirations for the internet were kind of referenced by Namjoon Paik. But the work is on the one hand very pre-digital, but on the other hand, very much part of that history, and so it just kind of makes sense to start there. Namjoon Paik was also really highly influenced by conversations with John Cage, the experimental musician. John Cage, there was kind of an overlap with the kind of Bauhaus school of design and kind of this really experimentalist tradition, and like Black Mountain College and all these really interesting sites of artistic practice. So, we could say that Namjoon Paik's work was on the one hand quite enthusiastic about technology, but at the same time, there were some caveats in the way that he talks about the work. Interestingly enough, some of the, like John Cage, for example, was very interested in Zen Buddhism, and Namjoon Paik, even though growing up in Korea and being exposed to Zen Buddhism, had never been specifically particularly interested in Zen Buddhism. But I think through some of the meetings that they were having, I believe it was in Dusseldorf, Germany, they were bumping up into each other and sort of getting interested in Zen Buddhism, and that sort of carries into some of the work of the other artists that we look at. Why is that relevant? Because I think Zen Buddhism has a number of these kind of double concepts, like almost like the binaries that are referenced in Haraway's Cyborg, such as human, machine, nature, culture, right? Zen Buddhism within it also has a number of terms that are in juxtaposition in that way. And so we also talk about the fashion designer Ray Kawakubo from Comme des Garçons, and also some of her collections quite very clearly reference these kind of binaries and kind of bringing them together with very organic looking sculptural fashion pieces. So we kind of follow those, and the hybridity of those works. I think one of the things that really makes them resonate with the cyborg is that kind of hybridity, whether it's the materials that are used, the concepts that are brought together. It could also be that art historians and curators who are attempting to categorize various artists' work, it seems to be a convenient way to categorize works when you can say, well, it's a hybrid. It's artistic practices by definition bringing different things into conversation with one another to make something that's new and interesting. And so you do see that kind of language around hybridity or cyborg kind of coming up in a lot of curators and artists' descriptions of works. And then, more recently, we look at also the artist Lee Hirschman Leeson, who now has, a series of films that have been made very recently that are on show at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and has really been working on cyborg and also bio inspired kinds of projects really since the late 60s. And now I think does stand in as one of, really a pioneer in experimenting with technology and a pioneer in experimenting with biology and sort of gene editing and that kind of thing. So very clearly tied to this tradition. One of the other artists that we talk about is the Korean artist Lee Bull, who's had a very large installation of sculptures on display and a solo show in Berlin at Gropius Bau a few years ago. And that work does very clearly reference the cyborg, but it sort of, you see these kind of suspended cyborg bodies, which are referencing in a way Japanese and or Korean anime culture, but with like missing heads and missing limbs. So they become a bit of like both a reference to that. They're very kind of feminine and cute bodies, but then because they're missing these limbs, they also become kind of eerie or abject, or send a different message. And the artist specifically wanted to have a commentary about the ways in which women's bodies were being mobilized in anime films and things like that. So
yeah. You brought up Gropius Bau, and that also reminded me, I was surprised, but then it all made a lot of sense when you referenced actually the Bauhaus in thinking about the cyborg. I'd love to invite you to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I haven't, we do try to tie it back to that history. I spent about 12 years working at the Institute of Design at IIT in Chicago, which has a very clear Bauhaus history. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy was the founder of the school, and in 1931. And the Bauhaus School itself was founded in 1919. So we recently celebrated the 100-year anniversary of the Bauhaus School of Design, which had its home in Germany, and then many of the artists and architects and others that were affiliated with the school, of course, had to leave Germany. And found their way to various, innovative curriculums all around the world, including Harvard School of Design, Black Mountain College, but also there was really diasporic movement of scholars who had visited the Bauhaus who went back to Japan and to Brazil and to India, for example. So, during the centennial year, there were a number of exhibitions that really did try to tell the story of the fact that the Bauhaus was actually a fairly short-lived institutionally, right? Like the original schools were really not around for all that long, and they were then moved from place to place. But then the fact that it has this longer enduring history where people really moved around the world. And I mean, I think on the one hand, we sort of today might look at the Bauhaus as the first steps towards the manufacturing of home goods, right? So the simplicity of the design, the sort of stark white modernism. So we very much tie it to some of those aesthetic traditions. But within the Bauhaus also, had a really rich history of the Bauhaus weaving tradition, which was mostly the women weavers who were involved in that. So I think we can sort of blame the Bauhaus for certain trappings of our modern life, but we also have to reclaim some of the possibilities in those practices. And the original Bauhaus manifesto was also organized around a series of kind of binary concepts that we can reference today.
I feel like now's a good time to draw attention to your notion of critical cyborg literacy, and one request, just factoring for it being 2024 and the word critical being a messy word in the public sphere. If you could describe kind of or put a little bit of extra attention to why you're approaching this from a place of critique.
Yeah. I'll happily kind of get started on this one. Yeah, so critical cyborg literacy we use or we offer up as a way to kind of use or be informed by the figure of the cyborg and all its sort of tensions and binaries and both and kind of sensibilities for thinking about how humans can better live with technology. The critical part, I think, is really important for both of us. So critical here, we're sort of, or at least I'm often thinking of kind of critical theory writ large, where the critical is not just critique, but the critical is actually indexing an analysis of power, right? So when we're saying critical cyborg literacy, it's not that we are necessarily just critiquing a bunch of things that we think are bad, but we are encouraging people to think about what are the power structures that are reified, that are made more or less flexible when we develop a certain technology, when a technology is embedded in a certain social or infrastructural system. How do technologies contribute to the negotiation of social dynamics, of power around binaries or power systems like race, gender, class, and coloniality? And how does that either constrain or open up possibilities for the future? So that's kind of what we mean by critical. I think that's also what's meant by critical and other formulations like critical race theory. And that being said, right, if we're talking about power, if we're thinking about how technologies can be used to level the playing field rather than maintain power imbalances, there's often a critique element to it in the sense of saying, well, that is maybe not the best way to spend our time or money or social effort. But we're not just wagging the finger, right? We're giving people a toolkit for thinking about how power operates with and through technologies. And again, with the cyborg as a kind of metaphor figure for some important reminders there.
Yeah, I think it's also to say that within many, many disciplines, including women's studies, disability studies, and studies of race, there can also be kind of a more mainstream part of the field, and then there can also be like a subculture or a sub conversation or smaller group that is really focused on a slightly maybe more radical version of the kind of politics and power that discipline engages with. So choosing different sorts of projects. And I think that's what we mean by flagging the word critical, is to affiliate with those parts of those fields that would understand some of the analysis of power, as Danya mentioned.
Amazing. And you apply this lens across and you acknowledge that the subject is massive and it, reaches into so many different domains. You really tighten the focus on labor, bodies, and culture. We've discussed culture a little bit already, so I'd love for us to kind of look into those questions of labor and bodies. Maybe we'll start with labor. I don't know which of you, the book feels enmeshed enough that I sort of think of it as a one author book. So I don't know who contributed more in what particular places. So feel free to take the lead where it makes sense for you.
No worries. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I'm glad that it reads that in a really integrated way.
Yeah.
So when we think about labor, we in this chapter we do use a number of science fiction films to tell the story. We also reference quite a bit sites of work, such as Amazon warehouse workers, where we think we could apply a critical cyborg literacy lens, and where that hopefully opens up new ways to think about those things. So if we just looked at Amazon warehouses specifically, one of the recent reporting about those warehouses might talk about the ways in which not only, of course, the ways that jobs are specifically named, right? So there's things like pickers is like one of the roles that you can play. There are a whole bunch, but I actually don't remember all of them at the moment. And then, there's the ways in which clearly they're being optimized for speed, right? So in order to ensure, one day delivery, which is, part of the offering of, something like Amazon Prime accounts, the ways in which humans have to be organized, right, in order to carry out that kind of customer service promise is extremely oppressive in many ways, right? So there are reports of people not having time to go to the bathroom. There are reports of injuries on site, and interestingly enough, the more a warehouse becomes automated by adding new kinds of robots to the warehouse, that actually increases the rate of injury by humans. So that point alone, I think, leads us to be able to tell an interesting story about technology that is not the one that you might see on, in the front page, right? So often you talk about, oh, well, we're going to automate things so that humans don't have to do this work anymore. But actually, much more often than not, we're going to see new ways of working with robots and automation at any kind of job site. So whether it's a white collar job like like banking, or a more of a blue collar labor like warehouse work, the ways in which humans and machines are being integrated is often not in service, of the actual workers. So it's actually making one's job maybe more difficult, maybe requiring you to speed up quite a bit in terms, and also more stationary. So in the New York Times reporting, for example, about warehouse work, workers were having to stand in a much more still positions, and so the work also became more mundane. And so you can see that introducing automation to any given workplace, doesn't necessarily have the kinds of claimed benefits that often will be talked about in terms of like saving humans from boring work. It actually creates, maybe in some cases creates more boring work. And so we tell, some of the stories about these various job sites. We also look at science fiction films to try to talk about different ways in which humans and technologies are coming together. Ultimately, to argue against claims of that humans are necessarily being replaced sort of in a one-on-one fashion, like one human replaced by one automated system. We want to talk a little bit more about how those things are coming into that they are being displaced, to use the words of scholar Lily Arani. So this idea that that in displacing a human job, you might create actually more but poorer quality new jobs. So it's about looking at what is the power dynamics of the kinds of new jobs that are being created. Are there better jobs for some people and worse for others? And of course, we know that these things are going to often be very much shaped by gender, race, disability, of course, and other kind of sociological and cultural factors that then create worse economic outcomes. So that's just to give you a sense of some of the kinds of ways that we're approaching labor in that chapter.
Yeah, yeah, and if I could, I'd love to pick up on a phrase that you used, Laura, which is the ways that workers in kind of high-tech setting like a modern warehouse are being optimized for speed, right? I think that's a really good example of a kind of human technology integration, or we might even say a way that humans are being made cyborg, that is probably not very desirable, right? Working your body harder, wearing it out faster, being at higher risk of injury because you're working with machines that set an unrealistic pace, right, is not the cyborg future we're hoping for, just to be very clear. I mean, I think the other thing there that I wanted to underscore is that there's all kinds of ways that people have been made to work like machines, at machine speed or in a very repetitive or systematic way that predates cyborgs, that predates cybernetics, right? That goes back to early 20th century management theory, or goes back to the Industrial Revolution in England, in the fabric mills, or in France, in the mechanization of the silk industry. Going back to the 18th or 19th century. And so cyborg is not the only metaphor for how humans work with or through or forced by technology in different ways. But it is a contemporary one, again, that underscores the kinds of power dynamics that get extended or embedded in the ways that we arrange work. And also the kind of way that cyber has come to index anything to do with computers now, right, also points to the ways that a lot of these processes are automated and are digitally governed, and therefore are extremely mobile, right? You can hire a worker in another country through email or through a digital platform in a way that is extremely easy and extremely incentivized in all kinds of ways. And that is, while there are some continuities with other ways that people have been made to work like machines, some aspects of the infrastructure, the digital technologies that we can use to govern it, are also quite distinctive to our current moment. So just a couple of things I wanted to add there.
I so appreciate that. And one thing that came up when I was reading, but it's coming up again now, is how, you know, during the pandemic, there were great strides made in acceptance of remote work, which of course many have been rolled back. But one thing that came with that was the deployment of surveillance tech on workers' computers to make sure that their mouse was moving a certain amount, or that there were keystrokes at a comfortable enough cadence that it implied that they were there. And like that feels to me like kind of a peak example of what you're describing, where it is a high-tech intervention, but it's not a high-tech intervention in this kind of like humanity plus type of way. It's this very oppressive form.
Right. Yeah. And I'm so glad you brought up Humanity Plus, because, again, I think that that's a really nice juxtaposition, right? Like modern day work environments, whether it's an Amazon factory or it's a white collar desktop computer worker, right, being surveilled by software, versus the kind of far future, augmentation of cognition, extension of life version of transhumanism advocated by an organization like Humanity Plus. I think what we're really thinking about and writing about in the book is much more, what are the ways that people are choosing or being forced to be cyborg today, right? What do those real world contemporary examples tell us about where we might be going, rather than sort of skipping all of the interim steps and just going forward to the utopia, right? Which is sometimes what more kind of technology focused transhumanists do, right? Again, we're thinking about the future. We're thinking about where we want to go, where other people want to go in the future, but thinking about it in a way that's really grounded in the practices that we have today. And so these are some of the practices, right? Or, many of us are cyborg already. Some of those ways of being cyborg are very uncomfortable, or very dangerous, right? And so we want to think about those as well as the possibilities, the comforts, the joys that might come with technology one day.
I feel like that's a beautiful segue into talking about the juxtaposition between the Cryptborg and the Triborg.
Sure.
So Laura, maybe I'll invite that.
Sure, yes. I mean, so one of the things that we do in the book is draw on the work of a number of disability studies scholars and philosophers of science and technology, such as Ashley Shue, and also the poet Gillian Weisse. And, you know, when we talk about the term triborg, actually is a term that Gillian Weisse gave to talk about people that are not disabled, but who, you know, I guess, think about their life in terms of augmentation with technology. So this might be quantified selfers who are, you know, using all kinds of self-tracking technologies, like even an Apple Watch or other things that they can use, and sort of that seem to be cyborg-like, but that Gillian Weiss says, you know, the real cyborgs are disabled people who live every day with prosthetic limbs, with, you know, insulin pump and sensor systems, with other kinds of, you know, heart pacemakers and things like that. So that's the triborg concept. Maybe I'll pass it to Danya for the cryptborg definition.
Sure. Yeah. So, if Triborg are non-disabled people who mess with their bodies using technologies to be better, right? Cryptborg is a term um, um, popularized by a number of scholars, including my colleague Ashley Shue, for thinking about disabled people who rely at various levels on different types of technologies to get through their day, right? So people who are um, using technologies necessarily, right? And so, you know, the kind of juxtaposition there is that we often hear a lot in the news about triborgs, right? So, like in 2011, and again, I guess last year, right, hearing a lot about like Google Glass, and there was like a new version of, right? What's in their new version that came out? I don't even, I
Well, there's
can't even.
Vision Pro from Apple.
Okay, well, yeah, Google Glass 2.0. Right. You know, so, you know, you hear about people using the cutting edge technologies, or like Laura indicated, right? People who really adhere quite quickly or quite closely to ideas about the quantified self and how to optimize their nutrition, their bodies, their exercise, their environments. We hear a lot about those applications of technologies in pop culture. We don't hear as much about the kind of everyday uses that disabled people are making uh, are making use of technologies for, right? And I think one of the distinctions there is not only what gets covered, right? There's always this, you know, sort of recency and novelty bias in the news. That's how the business has been constructed. That's how it works. But there's also a preference for kind of complexity, for digital things, for expensive things, for things that have a kind of nice, shiny, smooth, you know, Apple computer exterior, versus everyday technologies that might be digital, right? It might be a digital technology, like a digital insulin pump, might even be Bluetooth or wireless connected, but that maybe has more imperfections, right? Maybe it's not as attractive, or it might just be a fully analog tool, right? So thinking about modifications to living spaces like a doorway that is 36 inches wide, instead of so that a wheelchair or other assistive device can make it through. Or it might just be maybe a tool that you use to reach something from a higher shelf. Or maybe it is another person, right, who is providing assistance, not a technology at all, but someone who is kind of connected to you socially or connected to you through a healthcare system or healthcare infrastructure. Those things are just not as sexy to look at, to talk about. They don't feel new, but those are most of the technologies that most people are using most of the time to accomplish everyday tasks, right? Including disabled people, including what Ashley Shue and colleagues have called cryptborgs. So that's kind of the distinction there. And Gillian Weiss's kind of complaint in introducing the concept of the triborg, which was actually part of a really wonderful series of kind of edited essays published in the New York Times in 2017. It was a whole series of essays about disabled people and disability studies. Her kind of gripe there in juxtaposing disabled people and cyborgs is that this focus on novelty really takes a lot of air out of the room, and consequentially can even take resources out of the room, right? We hear about budget increases for medical research, about federal allocations for new technologies, or state allocations for a new cancer center. Meanwhile, that kind of distracts from the fact that the real dollar value of Medicaid is so low that many disabled people or families who rely on publicly subsidized healthcare can't access a doctor, right? Because it's not worth a doctor's time to accept such a low paying insurance, right? That is where most people who need where more people who need care are getting their care, not the shiny brand new cancer hospital that is experimenting with nanoparticles, which, by the way, we don't even really know if they're going to work for that particular cancer or not yet. So again, right, there's this effect of like sucking all the air, sucking all the resources out of the room, away from things that we know that works, putting them towards things that maybe will have a benefit, maybe will have a payoff many years in the future, but then often also for a much smaller slice of the population than the things that we know works would have and would do.
And since it's an Olympic summer, with the Olympics coming
Sure.
up, one of the times that you see a
Sure.
lot of technology for disability being promoted is around, the kind of superhuman abilities of athletes with prosthetics. And so you might even see, for example, fashion brands on Fifth Avenue in New York using prosthetics in their window display. So this would be kind of an example of this kind of excessive adoration of the high-tech solutions versus the DIY practices of a disabled person that might have various kind of things, workarounds or fixes that work for them to make the technologies work in the ways that they need them to, which is an incredibly creative and innovative act of kind of maintenance and repair and right. But yet, the ways that the headlines and the sort of attention is kind of focused on these other things, and there's a lot of attempts to garner the sympathies of the mainstream population by saying, oh, look, isn't this great, while no one's really paying much attention to what people do just to get through the day.
Yeah, maybe another way to put it is a lot of those, a lot of the cutting edge technologies are not actually about the people they're supposedly for. They're more about the technologies and the people who make them and what they think other people need, right? So there's certainly an element of paternalism sometimes as well in the kind of positioning and the way that high-tech solutions are rolled out as though they're a solution for everyone.
Yeah, and we reference a term that Liz Jackson uses, which is the disability dongle, which is sort of things that are invented for no particular disabled person's, problem. It doesn't really solve anything. It's just an imagined problem and an imagined kind of solution to that. I think since we talked a little bit about labor and the pandemic, one of the things that's useful to keep in mind is that while the pandemic made it possible for disabled people to actually work remotely, which is something that we have been asking for many, many years in the disability communities, right? As soon as the pandemic was over, people were sort of asked to return to the workplace, thereby making it, unaccessible once again. And disabled people are some of the most underemployed, as a category. It's a very diverse category, obviously, but yet, economic opportunities to just make a living are, still not available to a large extent.
First of all, that whole section I found to be really powerful and illuminating. You brought up the disability dongle. You also bring up this term access washing. There's another term, intimate infrastructures,
Sure.
in terms of thinking about like reframing our relationship to innovation as away from hypothetical moonshots and more about like what's innovative for real people in the material world right now.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think so intimate infrastructures is maybe an interesting way in that can also opens up something else I wanted to mention, right? Is that I think when we talk about intimate infrastructures, we're talking about things that are intimate in the sense of being attached to the body, right? Things that are with you 24 hours a day or 12 hours a day, things that may regulate features that are otherwise thought of as private or maybe even typically invisible, right? Or that you might want to keep private, even while you are using a particular device or tool. So there's intimacy in all of those senses. But another thing that it is always sort of evoked for me, this maybe goes beyond Laura's original intention. Laura originally coined this word in a paper in 2016 or 2017. But I've always thought of this idea of intimate infrastructures as a very powerful, specifically feminist intervention on how we think about technological infrastructure. And we haven't really talked about the feminist piece or the feminist part of our approach yet. So I'll use this as a way to kind of introduce that. Right. And again, I think feminists have been really banging on for decades, if not centuries, about how we don't pay enough attention to the things that we call our private lives, right? Our health, our family lives, the things that we need to do to take care of our own bodies or the bodies of our loved ones to be able to work or to go to school, to be a quote unquote productive citizen. So this idea of intimate infrastructures, in addition to like the kind of physical or visible, invisible dynamic of intimate, also gets me tapped into those longer running feminist critiques, right? That even though we might individually want something to be concealed, right, there is also a system of what we assume needs to be hidden or needs to be concealed that is very much shaped by gender and expectations of women being in the home doing the caretaking work, men being out of the home doing the politics and the waged labor. So for me, intimate infrastructures kind of indexes both. And so it's not only about thinking about how we live very closely with technology, but also how technologies and how the systems that govern them, like how visible or invisible are they? What forms, again, of power, of gendered power imbalance, of economic imbalances, of ableist dynamics, right? What is all of that that is also typically hidden by a large scale infrastructure like the power grid or internet infrastructure, that we can learn how to pay attention to and how to take seriously and how to try to fix when we start to look at some of the technologies people use on or with their bodies.
Yeah, I mean, I think with that term, I was very much thinking about large scale infrastructures that I had studied in previous research projects like wireless networks and smart cities, and thinking about how, in some sense, you could learn everything you need to know about those large scale systems by looking at some of the same types of questions that are raised in a small scale system, which is, an insulin pump and sensor system. And of course, we reference, the work of Susan Lee Starr, well-known feminist science and technology studies scholar, who talks about the idea that infrastructures become visible upon breakdown. And so when things are not working, a good kind of anthropologist of technology will be attuned to like look towards those moments as a ways to make knowledge about those systems, because right when these systems are working perfectly, it's also difficult to figure out, well, what is there interesting to say about the role of humans and technologies that come together in these various ways. But when things are not working, or in those moments, that's when they become, essentially they reveal themselves as situated in very particular ways, and allowing certain kinds of things to happen and disallowing certain things to happen. And so that's what kind of led me to think about why that term would be useful. But I do think it kind of is a shorthand for, yes, like a wide number of feminist arguments that one would make, and certainly, about paying attention to the body, and not having to apologize to your boss or at your workplace for having a body, because everyone has a body, right? And so, paying attention to the small scale, but I think that could also open up conversations around slowness or the pace of expectations, in professional workplaces and institutions. So yeah, I think that's really where I wanted to kind of bring those things into conversation. And it's perhaps aligned with some of the other arguments that we make in the book as well.
Mm. Well, I feel like, Danya, you precipitated this
Sure.
in looking at the so, Haraway takes this term from cybernetics, establishes the cyborg as you say, a figure through which we can, imagine and think through feminist ideas. And then, of course, in the wake of the Manifesto for Cyborgs, many critiques have further refined or diverged. So I want to kind of like open up to this kind of big topic of how the cyborg became a feminist figure, and then also looking to the contemporary understandings from within, feminist scholarship. And either one of you can jump in on that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think in the latter part of the book, we try to then talk about specifically race and disability, and how those things are kind of very much passed over in the original Cyborg Manifesto, and try to look at the work of scholars who are writing about race and disability specifically, in order to update the term, in line with some of these conversations today. So we with respect to race in the manifesto, while Haraway sort of points to the lived, work experience potentially of women from Southeast Asia or global supply chains, are kind of mentioned in passing, sort of used to mobilize the concept and the importance of the cyborg, without really taking into account, or even probably citing any work that really had looked into those labor conditions, right? And with respect to disability, the cyborg, it is a very kind of natural concept for the purpose of, thinking about disability. Many disability scholars and disabled people, and disabled, scholars of disability, do not like the term cyborg and don't use it, because, again, for the same reasons I think that Jillian Weissa mentions. And, because perhaps the Haraway's cyborg maybe was considered to be using the disabled body, but not really fully accounting for, or actually giving many examples of what it really meant. And so we try to surface both those critiques, in the latter section of the book, to really talk about how we might update. Like, we still find the concept so compelling and useful and exciting, offering possibilities for thinking about humanity and technology. But, we want to have a much more richer and deeper conversation about those kinds of questions in particular.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also interesting to think about kind of the feminist politics that Haraway was maybe trying to intervene on at the time, as well as the socialist politics. So I'm not going to get the subtitle right off the top of my head. I guess I can look in the bibliography of our book to make sure I get the subtitle of the manifesto right. A manifesto for originally published in 1985 in Socialist Review. The Cyborg Manifesto was titled "A Manifesto for Cyborgs: Science, Technology, and Socialist Feminism in the 1980s." Right. So the essay was published in a socialist scholarly journal, and was also intervening on conversations going on amongst feminists. Many of those conversations amongst feminists about technology in the early 1980s were quite negative, right? So Haraway's kind of corrective there, especially to like kind of the emerging paradigm of ecofeminism, was to say technology does not need to be our enemy, even though the way it's being developed today is very harmful to women around the world, right? So like part of the push towards imagination is how can we imagine technology or technology's context being developed differently so that technology does not have to be an enemy of women and an enemy of feminism, right? The intervention to socialist thought is kind of similar, but also kind of one of many voices intervening in socialist thought in the 1980s, kind of insisting on the importance of women and insisting on the importance of unwaged or unpaid work to broader questions of political economy, right? So there's kind of two direct interventions, and of course it becomes quite important in science and technology studies and many other fields where people are critically examining technology. So I think that's also something to foreground there. And so the cyborg again is this kind of playful figure. You know, the third part here is that Haraway is just like likes reading science fiction, right? So the cyborg is kind of you know, something that is kind of interesting to her, and because of its roots in the space race, because of the way that it is born out of both biology and technology, human and machine, and because it is kind of conceptualized as a way to break down boundaries, even in its kind of scientific idea, it kind of does some of that work, right, for her of breaking down the boundaries between humans and machines, offering a more positive way to imagine technology in the future, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to add a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, and we actually make some links to kind of Afrofuturist traditions as well, which also see great possibility in technology as a way of, improving, the lives of Black people. And, we also reference a critique of Afrofuturism by the artist Martine Sims, which is called the Mundane Afrofuturist Manifesto, which talks about the ways in which maybe Afrofuturism has become very trendy and popular and exciting, but at the same time, while that stories about social conditions, especially ones that are, specifically around race and disability, for example, or race in particular in this case, that we can't really wave a magic wand and make our social problems go away. So that if your Afrofuturist literature includes, improved living conditions, right? That it's unlikely that racism, for example, is going to go away anytime soon. And so I think that the artist's manifesto kind of picks up and sort of says, these things are difficult and messy. I don't really want to read about space traveling aliens and like the typical sci-fi type of tropes. And if you're engaging with social issues, then you might have a much more complex story to tell, and that you can't wave them around away with a science fiction new device or something like that.
Right. Right. I mean, I think that points to one other kind of recent critique of the cyborg, especially Haraway's version of the cyborg, which is that, especially, so there's this critique coming out of Black studies scholarship and critical race studies scholarship. It's kind of asking, well, why are we thinking about the post-human or the transhuman if not all humans have equal rights yet, right? And so there's this sense, I think we've talked about this kind of once or twice before so far today, right? Of thinking about the future from the position of the present rather than skipping all the complicated steps that it takes to get from here to 2100, right? And so I think there's kind of a similar critique of the cyborg, or at least discourses about the cyborg as being like overly white and skipping over uncomfortable realities today and the very difficult next steps that it might take to get to a point where technology can really offer an equal opportunity to everyone. And so, I think that's really important, right? When we think about racialized technologies, right, there are still medical devices like spirometers for measuring lung capacity that have a button on them that you press that race corrects, that basically says that Black people, if the doctor looks at you and identifies you as Black and presses a Black button, that it basically will say that for the same lung capacity, it will say Black people are healthier than white people, because there's this kind of persistent belief that kind of coming out of the 19th century in the context of enslavement in the United States, that Black people have sort of superhuman physical abilities, right? And when that was not the case, when they started getting Black lung and having lung damage from handling cotton, medical doctors, instead of reflecting on the damage that occupations were doing to Black people's bodies, just made a button to say they were healthier than they are, right? So you still see it embedded in medical technologies. You see it obviously in the context of digital technologies used for law enforcement, right? Inaccuracies in facial recognition technology, kind of weighting recommendations about imprisonment or parole based on race or based on factors that are closely correlated with race, right? So we're a very long way from technology being applied equally on the basis of race. And so, again, this is one of the critiques of this original 1980s figure of the cyborg. There is a lot of work that addresses this now, sometimes explicitly referring to the cyborg, sometimes referring to some of the problems that cyborg theory also deals with. So there's definitely a much more multifaceted conversation emerging here today.
Mm. You, after outlining a lot of these points in the book, you have a quote that I want to read here and ask you to speak to that kind of builds off this conversation. You write, "We ourselves are optimists. We think that things can get better and that technology will have to be involved. We argue that the conceptual shift away from a strict nature-culture divide must be paired with deeper historical consciousness and active political struggle in the present in order to grant full humanity to marginalized people."
Mm-hmm.
So I want to continue this conversation by including that quote.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great quote, and again, it brings up another dimension that we haven't yet talked about, right? Is that when we're talking about the better development of technology from the present toward the future, again, not jumping straight to the future, but from the present toward the future, it's not, the problems that need to be solved are not only, probably even not primarily technological, right? They're social and political problems. Another set of suspicions around the figure of the cyborg or cyborg theory comes from people who are more activism oriented, right? Who find some of the texts on the topic impenetrable, too jargony, embedded in traditions that don't necessarily have a lot to do with real world activism. I think the relationship goes the other way, right? I think the philosophy, the ideas, the engineering work is really reliant on activism and on political change to be able to accomplish all the things that philosophers and engineers want, right? Better access to technology, technology that fosters a sense of equality. I think anyone who builds technology, or the vast majority of people who build technology, here at my engineering institution, certainly, see themselves as doing good work that improves people's lives, right? But it is less certain that they will have a good outcome on that metric if there is not also an active politicized conversation about limiting the harms of technology and about trying to ensure to the best degree possible that all these biases that exist in our technologies today are eliminated and prevented in the future. So yeah, I would say philosophy and engineering are reliant on activists, even though maybe we are not speaking a language that is immediately useful to a protest movement in particular.
Yeah, and I think in terms of kind of expanding what it means to be human, one of the places that we can look for, examples would be kind of in the disability community and critical disability scholarship, in terms of, leaning into the term CRIP, So the term crip, it refers to the word cripple, which had been seen as a derogatory term. However, it's been reclaimed, as an identity by disabled people. And I think that one of the main purpose for that claiming of that term is to sort of argue that disability itself is an expansion of what it means to be human, that this difference and diversity, the ability to, and it actually came up a couple of weeks ago. Danya and I were in conversation with Ashley Shu about her new book, Techno Ableism. And one of the points that, we were able to discuss was really the ways in which, I think we talked a little bit about creativity and sort of innovation that people do on an everyday basis. But the other thing I wanted to mention was like humor and comedy, right? So humor, comedy, love, creativity, these are all things that I think we highly value as, some part of what it means to be human. And specifically comedy about disability, which, disabled people are very skilled at making jokes because the, living conditions, like you have these new moments of kind of recognition, and you build kind of new knowledge about the world through everyday situations, right? And my own experience was really that the reason that I started writing about my disability is because of the humorous situations that having technology attached to my body through tubing put me in these humorous situations. And one of the examples of that is just standing at the kitchen counter, with the insulin pump and tubing, sort of kind of getting tangled up on the knobs of the kitchen cabinets when I went to turn around. And so like this was like a moment where I was just like, oh my God, this is hilarious. Talk about entanglement, like one of those words that comes up all the time in academia today, especially when talking about post-human and more than human and, kind of feminist theorists like Karen Barad. We talk about entanglement all the time, but like this is like literally entanglement. If we can create new forms of human expression that relate to all these topics around race and disability, that is certainly evidence that these things, that diversity and difference is an expansion of our abilities to create and express. So, so that's where I want to kind of go with that part of that particular quote you read. And thanks for pointing attention to that.
As I expected, we have now gone for a little over an hour, and I feel like, we're just getting started, so I can't wait to have both of you back individually. There's one more topic I'd like to cover that's not as much of an area of emphasis in the book, but has come up in your respective lines of inquiry, which is around this like big kind of hyper object of AI in culture. And so I'll leave it very broad at the moment. How are you thinking about this contemporary wave of AI through the lens of critical cyborg literacy?
I'm happy to jump in first here. So I am where I encounter it most obviously right now is in my teaching, right? And students using ChatGPT or Grammarly's always creeping features, or other types of AI assistants or LLMs in student work, and that's I think of that a lot through the lens that we apply to labor and work in the book, right? That these are tools that already extract a lot of work from people who are uncompensated, right, for their creation, whether it's artists or posters on Reddit or other contributors to online sources. The products themselves are in various ways going to make the companies hope it will make the companies that own them very rich. So there's already an extractive dynamic there. But then on the student side, I really worry that it is going to end up de-skilling this current generation of students. So de-skilling is a term that comes up in labor history a lot. It's when a particular skill set that someone has, like the ability to write a 10-page paper in clear prose with orderly arguments and well-researched evidence, right? That's the ideal in a college paper, right? When you take that large skill and you break it up into little parts and you give some of it to the machine, right? So students, for example, don't necessarily outline their papers by themselves. They put a bunch of ideas into ChatGPT and they tell ChatGPT to write them a paper outline. Or they write a rough draft with a lot of grammatical mistakes and they tell Grammarly to fix it up, but not too good because they still want the professor to think that it's theirs. Or they'll introduce a few errors after the fact, right? Or maybe they don't know what the argument of their paper is. So again, they put in a bunch of sentences and they have the computer summarize it down to one sentence, and then that's their new thesis statement, right? So these are some of the common things that I've discussed with students in the past year. But all of those skills of evaluating and organizing and communicating information are like basic human skills, right? That you need to like have a conversation, let alone succeed at any job. And so I really worry that that this is a de-skilling question, that by farming out certain parts of this larger task to a machine, students are not getting the skills that they need to have a durable chance at life, right? Maybe right now they know how to use ChatGPT and Grammarly really well for them to succeed, but we've seen time and time again that companies, large digital first tech companies can just discontinue a product, and then you don't have that service, and then you need to figure out other ways to do what you used to use that tool to do, right? Google is notorious for this, right? Closing down its RSS feed like broke the hearts of many nerds a couple of years back, right? Or a new tool comes along and automates maybe the last couple of things that humans do, and then any humans who could do half the job are out of a job, but the humans who could do the whole job maybe still have a job, and the humans who trained in another area maybe have a job as well. So I really worry about that for this current generation. But again, sort of viewing it through the lens of critical cyborg literacy, I think takes it out of the realm of just a moral panic that kids are using computers too much into like an actual very concrete question of what is the purpose of college? What is the purpose of education? How can young people best defend against the rapid transitions in our economy to have the best life chances? I think that's a much more serious set of questions. So that's what I think about almost every day. I was talking about it over coffee again this morning. So that's my starting point.
Yeah, for me, I would reference again the idea of critical cyborg literacy as a lens to view AI. For me, I have tended to focus less on some of the current applications, such as LLMs and generative AI image systems, and focus a little bit more on those technologies that are claimed to be smart, such as the smart insulin pump and sensor system that I use. I like to move away from discussing just AI on its own, but consciously use the term AI system every time I reference it so that it flags that AI actually can't do anything on its own, that AI is software, it's hardware, it's changing batteries, it's plugging things in, right? And so I think often the common press representations of AI, tend to reify the human machine binary by making it seem that the AI is kind of independently able to do things, when in fact, if we adopt more of a socio-technical lens, we deliberately join the social and the technical in a way in our minds and through language to keep the human machine as a dynamic relationship. And so I think that the book does help to approach AI very much. And I think the 10 principles that we raise at the end of the book, we try to really flag some of the top, 10 learnings from the book, but also from the fields that we work in, like science and technology studies, the situatedness of technology, the fact that it's prone to failure and glitching, the fact that failure and glitching can be both a critique, but also a possibility, and many others. And so that's kind of my general approach to all questions about AI, is to really to start talking about, well, what technologies are we actually talking about? What is the context in which they're deployed? Who is involved with using them, who has power over whether or not these systems are deployed and in which ways. And I think that that is a helpful guide.
Yeah, I said that was the last big topic, but you brought up the glitch. You brought up like binaries, and I realized we haven't talked about sort of how the cyborg might help us trouble binaries, and where historically sort of binaries come from, or dualisms sort of come from. Also semi-related, we also didn't talk about gestation. So I don't know that we need to get into all of that necessarily, but I'm just sort of like flagging things that I'm like, oh yeah, that, oh yeah, that, oh yeah, that. So if any of those spark something for you, I'd love to invite that as well.
It's a lot
Yeah,
of stuff.
I think in terms of where do binaries come from, we often will reference, hundreds of years of, Western Enlightenment scientific thinking, for which we have many things to thank for the kinds of world that we live in today. But also where we place some of the blame for dividing up the world in such a way. So, like, this is definitely a moment when, not a moment, but like a long series of historical, advances, in which, we pushed kind of maybe more mystical thinking to the sidelines in favor of scientific thinking, right? So, and that, we lost something in that trade-off. We also gained, many medical innovations and things that, are still certainly the underpinnings of today's science and technology and medical fields. So I think that we often do situate the critique as emerging from hundreds of years of thinking about the individual human in a certain kind of way, as kind of disconnected from the world, and as kind of an individual agent, but yet that some of these post-human or more than human types of philosophies are about rejoining the human back with our natural environment, thinking more relationally, certainly looking to other societies and civilizations that have already have very different ways to think about the world. So we could look at ancient, Japanese history and look at Shintoism. We could look at indigenous understandings of circular time. There are many ways we could go with that. But yes, those are kind of some sort of starting points for that question.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, again, we've talked about how the cyborg can break down certain types of boundaries, right? Like way back in the beginning, we were talking about like imagination versus reality, right? I've talked a little bit about negotiating like future and present and how those could be more continuous versus more separate in different worldviews. And so I think we've touched a little bit on some of that. I mean, one of the big binaries that the cyborg is also is often used to think about is the gender binary between male and female or man and woman, right? And so again, I think this is one of the playful reasons why Haraway chooses this as a figure for thinking about feminism and technology. Right? The cyborg is in its original 1960 conception, right, as a human body augmented by technology. But through that fusion, it is more. It is even other, right? It is a way for humans to become extraplanetary or interplanetary, right? So I think the cyborg is often used as a metaphor for thinking across other binaries, not only animal machine or man machine, but also man and woman, male and female, right? If we get rid of these distinctions, or if we at least like take away some of their social power, right? How can all of humanity benefit? I think is the big question posed there. I think another thing to think about, Laura brings up other philosophies and some of these historical questions. You know, binaries are embedded in how science works, Western science works, and always has been, right? One of the kind of great hotbeds of early modern theorizing, not only about science, but also about the scientific method, is like the 1660s in London at the initiation of the Royal Society, right? And that was an organization that did not allow women to participate or be members, that was largely pro-Protestant, that limited membership based on class status, specifically, whether the members could own property or not. So there were all of these binaries around uh, gender and class and religion. Race wasn't even talked about, right? It wasn't even seen as relevant, even though in the 17th century there certainly were people, people we would now say are people of color living in England and in London. Um, so some of these binaries are built into the very infrastructure of science and technology themselves as well. And so it's kind of not a surprise that you get a Sophia from an institution that is founded on the exclusion of women, right? Or from a social project that is founded on the exclusion of women. So again, it's one of those things where there are these very strong continuities, um, very continuous threads around exclusions. And again, I think the hope is that the cyborg as this symbol of a way for humans to overcome or move past their biological limitations also indexes ways that we might overcome or move past some of these social limitations that we're so embedded in that sometimes we don't even notice.
Mm. So much more to get into, but for that, people need to go read the book. I have 3 recurring questions that I like to do with each guest, so I'm going to jump into those. What is one thing you wish people paid more attention to? Laura,
All right,
maybe.
I'll take it. Yeah. I really struggled. You sent these ahead. I really struggled with this one. What is one thing I wish people paid more attention to? I wish that when people talk about science and technology, they paid more attention to the context and not just the content, right? Again, these really basic questions, really basic for social scientists, basic for feminists across fields of who benefits and who's harmed, right? I think there is definitely a move toward that, especially in tech reporting in recent years, although the pandemic kind of disrupted the way some of that was going. So there are sort of glimmers of hope and some kind of fellow travelers, but I would love to see people paying more attention to these questions of benefit and harm when they talk about technological innovation in contexts outside of the academy.
Mm.
Yeah, I think I already kind of gave away my answer to this one, which is really to think about a CRIP understanding of disability, and specifically thinking about disability as an expansion of what it means to be human, particularly because many people will become disabled in one way or another as they age. So it is a very common experience among humans. And yet there are, you know, plenty of everyday examples all the time. It's just that these are very um, lesser known, ways of life. Just learning about how people are living, I think is itself very eye opening. And so finding ways to make those visible. And I mean, of course, one of the best known writers and advocates around disability, Alice Wong, has a book called Disability Visibility. So I'd say,
And a
go.
wonderful podcast archived as well. Yeah.
Exactly. And those stories are by disabled people about all kinds of different ways that, human difference, through disability is humorous, is loving, poetic. I think the new book is actually called Crip Intimacies. So it really does look more at, the what is care and love in those situations. So yeah.
Mm. Well, that segues very nicely to the next question, which is, what is one resource you use or recommend to make better sense of reality?
I was going to recommend 2 things. One was the Tactical Tech Digital Detox Kit, which is something that I've put on my syllabi and I think is a really interesting way to think through your own everyday use of technology. And it's sort of almost like an advent calendar of sorts, where it gives you kind of one task, I think, per day or per week, and then you can kind of complete it in a month. And it just allows you to think differently about the everyday platforms that you use, software that you use, and sort of the politics embedded within them, that ethics and values and trade-offs and notions of justice. And so I would definitely recommend that. I think the second, in order to really try to make more sense of AI, Eric Salvaggio's Cybernetic Forest Substack is just such a rich, incredible resource. And I was trying to find out whether he'd already been on your show. I was kind of guessing probably yes.
Yeah, we just recorded the episode, but it's not out yet. Him and Caroline Cinders, so it's
awesome.
very in sync. Yeah,
Cool.
I'm gonna leave Laura's answers to that. I love those.
amazing. And then finally, what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
I would say, maybe carrying on from our conversations today, I found, as many people did, I'm sure, the pandemic extremely disruptive. And I think exactly for, something I keep talking about, or we both talked about, which is this combination of sense of possibilities opening and closing. Right. I think the conjunction of the pandemic with kind of large racial justice protest movements, the political, economic shifts, like direct payments to individuals, and expansions and extension of healthcare coverage, was an incredibly exciting set of possibilities. The shift towards, and at least in some institutions and workplaces, continued inclusion of remote work as part of a solution, if not all, felt like things that I did not think I was going to see in my adult lifetime. But then just as rapidly, like the closure of all of those possibilities, it was incredibly dark. so, um, so, on top of that, I'm a lifelong hypochondriac. So it really, really shook me to the core. So I don't really have anything better there. But I think it's that dynamic of possibilities opening and closing. We were also writing the book mostly during the pandemic, 2020, 2021. So I think even if we don't talk about the pandemic there, it certainly was the experience that structured our writing, our introspection, our reading, and our conversations as well. So it was, I would say, it was actually quite important, the important infrastructure for understanding the book.
I was trying to think about possible answers to this question, and the one that I arrived at was in 2005, my first trip to Berlin. I found so spatially and temporally different than day-to-day life in New York, that I think that really opened up a really different kind of day-to-day patterns and different spaces. And I still find that, with certain cities, when you kind of move, of course, you can notice that really in any new city or new place you go, of course, has its own culture, its own rhythms, its own temporalities, its own ways of moving through space. But that one in particular was very memorable, and it's a city that I really love going back to for that reason.
Amazing. Well, that is all I have in terms of questions. I so appreciate you both being here. I again want to plug, everybody listening or watching needs to go buy this book. Any other like places people can find you, or things you have on the horizon that you're wanting to share?
You should keep an eye out for us in the fall. So we'll be doing some more discussions and talks in various formats around the book in the fall. So if you want to come say hello in person, I know we'll certainly be in New York sometime in September. I'll be in Boston as well. So look us up, reach out to us on Twitter, send us an email. We'd love to be in touch and invite you to anything we're doing in the future.
Yeah.
Amazing.
I don't have anything to add, just lots of social media handles. I'm always at Laura #4 LANO, Laura Forlano, and that's where you can find me.
On Twitter, you can find me at Allergy Ph.D.
Amazing. So go find them both. Thank you both so much. It's been an incredible conversation.
Thanks
Thank
so
you,
much.
Jesse. Take care.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.